Xexyz. Probably one of the most awkwardly named NES titles ever. This is actually a personal favorite of mine in the NES library, definitely top 10. And while it's not a perfect game, I certainly think it's an interesting one. And if you're into collecting NES games, I think it's one you gotta have. Now, the story of Xexyz is a little mostly not there. I mean, it is an NES action game. There isn't a huge focus on story. The Japanese Famicom version was based on the stories of Urashima Taro, the man who rescued a sea turtle, got taken to an underwater kingdom, spent the day there, got homesick, went back home only to find 100 years had passed. I think the Famicom version takes place like as a sort of futuristic retelling of it with his ancestors, but in the North American version, you just play as some guy named Apollo rescuing princesses from mecha castles, basically. Well, I think the change to the story kind of makes a lot of sense, seeing as most people in North America wouldn't really know the Japanese folklore behind what inspired this game. You do lose some of the impact of some of the actual bits of the game. Like, a lot of the vehicles in this game are based around mechanized sea creatures, and when you take away the connection to the, story about the undersea kingdom and the fisherman who rescued a turtle, suddenly you just some guy riding around on fish. And I mean, that's fine, but it's certainly a lot less meaningful. Overall, though, this is an NES action game. Story is hardly the focus, but, it's nice to pick up little bits of lore in every room as NPCs interact with you and tell you what's going on and give you hints on the stage, which you're definitely going to need because this game's got a bit of NES jank to it. Xexyz, in terms of gameplay, is kind of a mixed hybrid game. The best way I could describe it is sort of like mixing a run and gun, sort of like a Contra, with a side-scrolling shooter. And it's a pretty solid game. I mean, it's by Atlas, of all people, and they always make pretty good things. But what's interesting about this game is a lot of it takes place in two phases. In the first phase, you end up running around as Apollo, trying to effectively enter the Mecha Castle and assault the Mecha Castle so you can go fight the Mecha King to go rescue the land. But as you actually make your way into the Mecha Castle, suddenly it turns into a side-scrolling shmup. And I think that's pretty interesting. I don't think either are the most super well polished, but still very, very enjoyable. There are 3 issues I have with this game I've found, and 2 of which are merely a fact that it is a game of its time. First and foremost is this game does have a lot of NES obtuse level design. The first level alone, the first time I played this, I was completely lost as to what you were supposed to do. Like, you start out on the left, you gotta go to the right, right? Well, when you get to the right side of the screen, you come to a door that's actually locked, and you have no seeming way of actually unlocking this. If you were paying attention to some of the NPCs and some of the doors you were going past, you might have picked up that there's actually like a secret hidden door in the first stage, and what you need to do is go shoot a specific marked block on a specific pillar. Bear in mind, there are several of these throughout the stage, and you'll make a door appear. And if you hop through that door, you can fight a mini-boss that will give you the key to the world, effectively. That is certainly not the most obtuse I've ever seen the NES get, but it's just a little obnoxious how kind of unclear some of this stuff is at the start. And if you don't know that that door's there, you might as well start the level over and effectively play the level twice, which is a little awkward. The second issue I have with this game that is definitely an artifact of its time is this game doesn't have a lot of it, but there is some aggressive flashing that I'm gonna cut around, but if you're photosensitive, you might want to skip this game. Basically, after you kill every boss, the screen flashes really aggressively. Doesn't last for too long, but I still ended up feeling a bit headachy after the end of this, so just as a heads up. But this is an NES game. They did that a lot, and it could have been a lot worse, for sure. The last real issue I have with this game is just some of the stage design. I haven't really talked much about this yet, because we're going to get to it, but like I said, this game has 2 stages. The platforming stage, and then the shooting stage. And the shooting stage can actually be broken up into sort of like 2 sub-stages in each castle, which are broken up, again, by like 2 little mini platforming segments. And the first shooting stage out of every castle is just kind of weird. When you get to the end of it, you are greeted with 2 doors. And you have to pick whether you want to take the top door or the bottom door. And here's where there's actually something completely objectively bad with this game. If you pick the wrong door, you have to go back to the start of the shmup segment. So it's just pick a random door and you got a 50-50 chance you're going to have to redo the entire area. That's awful. And I can't imagine why that's there. Like, that is, at best, a way to milk gameplay. But at worst, that is just actively punishing your players for just making the random wrong decision. That is Sierra grade levels of harassing and just torturing your players just for, making a decision that's not clear as to what's going on, and you have no information going into it how to solve it. It's just make a random choice, hopefully you don't screw up. And that's awful. That said, the platforming is actually quite good. It's a little bit unclear, but there is actually two different types of jumps. You have a standard jump where you jump, and a second jump where you jump slightly higher because you held up. That's probably not immediately clear. You also have a weapon, which is displayed in the top right corner, and that is actually a manageable resource. Your weapons take energy, and here's where the game gets a little bit interesting. Because, not unlike Monster Party, another classic NES game, personal favorite of mine, every stage is dotted with doors that you can enter. And some of these doors have random NPCs you can talk to. Some will give you mini games, some will offer you to sell you a weapon, others will offer to power up your weapon, others will switch weapons, others are boss fights. But every NPC that involves like some sort of bartering system will take away energy from your weapons. So if you want that shiny new weapon, that's fine, but you're going to exchange its potential energy for just having it. Or if you want hints on how to solve each stage, well, again, you might have to swap your weapon energy for it. Healing yourself, gotta exchange for that too, in the nurse's office. There is a lot going on here with just managing the resources of your weapon energy, and that's great. The weapons themselves are okay. You've got a standard shot, you've got like a bouncy ball shot, you've got like a wave shot. Ironically, I think that the standard shot's probably one of the more useful ones, but as you power them up, sometimes you get like a second shot, so they do get better, provided you're willing to put in the energy to actually use them. Standard enemies tend to be clumped a little bit tightly together, and I could stand to have a little bit more invulnerability, as sometimes it feels like you're a little bit trapped, and it feels very claustrophobic when you're surrounded by enemies. And the scrolling sections in the shmup bits do tend to get a little bit aggressively fast, which makes it hard to make really informed, conscious decisions about what you're supposed to be doing, as opposed to just sort of flying around randomly and hoping you don't careen into a wall or an enemy. It gets a little bit bad. And some of the bosses in the shmup stages just have absurd amounts of health. Like, that is absolutely begging for a turbo button or something. But all in all, I think it's an interesting combination of gameplay elements. Being able to solve basic puzzles, and just as obtuse as some of the level design is in the platforming, I do love the idea of just exploring these worlds and finding all these hidden secret things in order to solve the mysteries of this world. There's something very sort of almost archaeological about it, you're solving the world's secret mysteries, and doubly so because it's a game that it was released so long ago. The shooting and jumping are okay, and there's some power-ups that help make it feel a lot better, but they're just sort of okay. And the shmupping, while the door selection is terrible, I still think it's a lot of fun. Ultimately, I think Xexyz is more than the sum of its parts. If you take any individual part of Xexyz, you kind of have an okay mediocre platformer, an okay mediocre shooter, with some interesting ideas and some frustration, but ultimately when you combine the two, you've got something that's just so interesting and different, and while it's certainly not the most well-polished, I certainly think it's something memorable, and I think those are the kind of NES games that really resonate the most with me. I mean, have you seen some of the other NES games I've gushed about here? But the fact that they're so interesting and that they try to do something, and that they try to do something not perfectly but competently enough that they get around it, honestly kind of makes it better to me. The overall presentation to Xexyz is decent. The sprite work is actually quite nice. I'm quite a huge fan of Apollo's sprite. That's a great NES sprite right there. The NPCs and bosses all look great. The bosses in particular are huge and interesting, and once again, kind of go back to the mythos of where this game initially came from, which is sea creatures, not unlike Darius, which is cool. And the audio is decent. I don't think anything here is gonna be terribly memorable. I don't see myself humming the tunes to this game a month from now. Heck, I don't even really offhand remember any of the individual tracks, but they worked for what they needed to do, and that's fine. Overall, I think the presentation, the audio could be better, but I think it's totally fine. Now, if you want a copy of Xexyz on the NES, probably the most awkwardly named game on the system, cheapest one I'm seeing on eBay right now, $30. And while I think that might be a tad steep for an NES game, I think this one is definitely worth it. I don't think it's a super long game. There's about 10 stages across the game or so, but I still think it's quite a lot of fun. And like I said earlier, you know, I don't think this is the most well-polished NES game. It's rough in all the right places as to just make it more enduring, you know? It's not perfect. It's an amalgam of two things that aren't perfectly well done, but in its roughness, it feels like it has more personality and more character, you know? I mean, like I said, go look at my other NES reviews, but stuff like this, Clash of Demon Head, Kabuki Quantum Fighter. I mean, Monster Party, holy crap, Monster Party. That one was incredibly rough and weird, but still, amazing, amazing game, total must-have for the system, easily one of my favorites. Stuff like that is just off. And far from perfect, but still a very, very fun experience, honestly makes it more of an interesting game than, like, say, Super Mario Bros. 3 to me. In attempting to make something different, even if you don't succeed, you've made something special. I don't know, I guess I'm just more interested in games that do something different and take chances and risks, and even if they don't succeed, but are at least playable and enjoyable, I think that's better. And this definitely fits that bill. If you want to explore some of the more unique aspects of the NES, it might be worth checking out Xexyz, because, awkward name aside, it is one of those really fun experimental games, and heck, it was by Atlas. They make good stuff.